Part 5. County Limerick, April 1847. The little garden behind the cottage had become the centre of the children's world. Every morning Seamus inspected the tiny rows his mother had planted. The cabbage seeds, the onions, the turnips. Nothing had appeared yet. Still he looked. Hope, he was discovering, was something that needed tending just as carefully as a garden. Breed followed behind, carrying a cracked tin cup. "I'll water them. They don't need watering. I'm going to anyway." She poured 3 drops onto the bare earth. "There," she smiled proudly. "They'll grow now." Breda laughed. "I expect they will." The mysterious parcels continued, never enough to make them comfortable, always enough to make tomorrow possible. Breda had begun keeping 1 oat from every sack in a small jar on the mantel, not because it served any purpose, because she wanted to remember. "If we ever discover who this is, I'll show them this jar." "Why?" Breda asked. "So they know every gift mattered." Several miles away, Edward guided his horse toward the village. This time he had no food hidden in his satchel. He had come for answers. He tied the horse outside the smithy. The blacksmith looked up from his anvil. "Morning, Master Edward." "Morning, Mr. Collins. What brings you here?" Edward hesitated, then quietly asked, "Did you know Seamus Keane?" The hammer stopped. The old blacksmith rested both hands upon its handle. I knew him well." "What sort of man was he?" Mr. Collins looked surprised. "You come all this way to ask me that?" Edward nodded. "I have." The old man smiled faintly. "Well," he said, "he was the sort who'd mend a neighbour's gate before fixing his own." Edward listened carefully. He'd stopped to help a stranger, though it meant reaching home after dark. The blacksmith chuckled. "And he never could pass this forge without arguing that my horseshoes cost too much." Edward smiled. "He argued with everyone." "Oh, yes, but always with a grin." The old man became quiet. "Funny thing is—" "What?" "The day he pulled you from that river," he shook his head, "none of us thought he'd done anything remarkable." Edward frowned. "You didn't?" Mr. Collins looked genuinely puzzled. "No." "Why not?" "Because," he replied softly, "that's exactly what Seamus Keane would have done." Edward rode away more slowly than he had arrived. He had expected stories about a hero. Instead, he heard stories about an ordinary man. Perhaps, he thought, that was what made him extraordinary. That afternoon he found Father O'Donovan walking among the graves behind the church. The priest smiled warmly. "Master Edward." "Father, what can I do for you?" Edward looked towards a simple wooden cross. "I've been asking about Seamus Keane." The priest nodded. "So I hear. I wanted to understand him." "And have you?" Edward shook his head. "Not yet." The priest folded his hands. "Then let me tell you something." Edward waited. "The day you fell into the river?" "I remember very little." "No, I imagine not." The priest looked toward the hill. "Your father rewarded Seamus because he saved his son's life." "Yes, but Seamus never once spoke about that reward." "He didn't?" "No. He spoke instead about something else." "What?" The priest smiled. "That he was glad your mother didn't have to bury a child." Edward stared at him. "That was all?" "That was enough." For several moments neither spoke. Finally Edward asked, "Father?" "Yes." "Would he have done it if I hadn't been the landlord's son?" The priest answered without hesitation. He wouldn't have known the difference. The words stayed with Edward all afternoon. They stayed with him throughout supper. They remained long after the candles had been extinguished. He lay awake, staring into the darkness. He had always believed Seamus had saved someone important. Now he understood. Seamus had simply saved someone. That night, Edward packed another canvas sack. Oats, rice, a little flour, tea. Then he paused. He looked toward the estate kitchen. The cook had baked fresh brown bread that afternoon. He waited until the house was asleep and then quietly slipped downstairs. He hesitated outside the pantry door. His hand rested on the latch. "I'm not stealing," he whispered. "I'm borrowing." He smiled. "No." After a moment he corrected himself. "I'm sharing." He took 1 loaf, nothing more. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds when he reached the Keane cottage. The lane was darker than usual. He tied his horse well away from the house. The animal knew the routine now and stood patiently behind the trees. Edward carried the sack to the doorstep. As he bent to place it down, he heard laughter. Inside the cottage, children laughing. He froze. It was such an unexpected sound that he found himself smiling. He stepped back into the shadows. The laughter continued. For nearly a minute he remained there, listening. It had been many months since he had heard children laugh because of something he had done. Quietly, almost without thinking, he whispered into the darkness, "Thank you, Seamus." Not to the little boy inside the cottage, to the man who had once carried him from the river. Then he disappeared once more into the night. Part 6. County Limerick, April 1847. The first shoots appeared on a Tuesday. They were so small that Breda almost missed them. Tiny slivers of green pushing bravely through the dark soil behind the cottage. She knelt immediately. "Seamus!" Her son came running. "What is it?" She pointed. For a moment he saw nothing. Then his face lit with wonder. "They're growing!" "They are." Breed hurried over, nearly tripping on the hem of her dress. "Can I see?" Breda lifted her gently. "There." Breed gasped as though she'd discovered treasure. "They're alive." Breda smiled. "So are we." The children began visiting the little garden every morning. Breed greeted each new sprout as if it were an old friend. Seamus counted them carefully. 12, the next day 15, then 18. Each green shoot became proof that the earth had not abandoned them forever. Across the estate, Edward's lessons continued. Not with tutors, not with books, but with people. He found old Mrs. Ryan sitting outside her cottage, mending a torn shawl. She squinted up at him. "Well now." "Young Master Edward, what brings the gentry to my doorstep?" Edward smiled. "I've been asking about Seamus Keane." Her hand stopped sewing. "You have? I wondered if you knew him." "Knew him?" She laughed softly. "I knew him before he was old enough to shave." Edward sat upon the low stone wall. "What was he like?" Mrs. Ryan smiled at a memory. "When my Patrick broke his leg," she began, "there was snow 2 feet deep." Edward listened. "No doctor could reach us, so Seamus walked." "Walked?" 5 miles. "In that weather?" She nodded. "He fetched the doctor." Edward frowned. "Did anyone ask him to?" "No. He simply heard we needed help." Mrs. Ryan looked toward the distant hills. "He never told anyone he'd done it." "How did people find out?" "The doctor mentioned it." She smiled. Seamus would have been embarrassed if he'd known. Edward remained silent. Every story sounded the same. No one described a hero. They described a neighbour. That evening, Edward rode slowly through the estate. The famine was impossible to ignore now. Children searched hedgerows for nettles. Old women gathered sorrel beside the roads. A man knelt, digging for wild roots. Not one of them looked up as he passed. Months earlier he might never have noticed. Now he saw every face, every hollow cheek, every tired pair of eyes. The estate looked different, or perhaps, he thought, I do. At supper his father unfolded estate accounts across the dining table. The arrears continue to grow. Edward glanced at the column of figures. "So many?" His father sighed. "They simply cannot pay." Edward hesitated. "Can they grow anything?" "Very little." His father rubbed his forehead. "This blight has ruined nearly everyone." Edward looked again at the figures, and for the first time he realized each number represented a family, not a debt, a family. Later that night he opened the small notebook hidden beneath his bed. He turned to a blank page. Instead of writing about oats or rice, he wrote something else. "What sort of man do I want to become?" He stared at the question for several minutes. Then beneath it he carefully wrote, "Like Seamus Keane." He read the words twice, then quietly closed the notebook. The following afternoon, Father O'Donovan found Edward standing beside the river. "You've chosen the same place again." Edward nodded. "I think better here." The priest smiled. "So did Seamus." Edward looked surprised. "He came here often?" "When he needed quiet." Father O'Donovan rested both hands on his walking stick. "You're changing." Edward looked down. "Am I?" "I believe so." Edward was silent for a long while. Finally he spoke. "I used to think Father gave Mrs. Keane 3 years without rent because it was generous." The priest waited. "Now I think—" Edward struggled to find the words. "I think it was only fair." Father O'Donovan nodded. "I agree." Edward picked up a flat stone and skipped it across the river. "I've been wondering something." "What?" "If Seamus hadn't jumped—" He couldn't finish. The priest answered anyway. "You would have died." Edward nodded. "I know. What troubles you?" Edward watched the ripples disappear. "I don't remember thanking him." The old priest smiled gently. "You were only a child." "I know, but I wish I had." Father O'Donovan placed a hand upon the boy's shoulder. "Perhaps," he said quietly, "you're thanking him now." That night another parcel appeared outside the Keane cottage. This one held less food than usual. Edward had found it harder to obtain supplies without attracting attention. Still, there was enough. As he stepped back into the darkness, he noticed movement inside. Little Seamus was peering through a gap in the shutters. Edward froze. The boy's eyes searched the night. For one terrifying moment, Edward thought he'd been seen. Instead, little Seamus whispered into the darkness, "Thank you." Edward felt something tighten in his chest. The child couldn't see him. The words had been spoken to the night itself, to whoever was listening. Edward tipped his head ever so slightly, though no one could witness it. Then he slipped silently into the trees. As he rode home beneath the sky full of stars, he realized something. Months earlier, he had been trying to repay a life. Now, he simply wanted to deserve the one he had been given.